Well, welcome everyone to the Bloomberg COP26 Climate Special. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Glasgow. Now, we're getting some pictures, I think, of leaders arriving at COP26. Momentarily, they'll also come through the door, and then they'll join us close to where we are at COP26. We're right close to the plenary. A lot of people coming in and out. Over the next 2 weeks, it's about 30,000 delegates. Now, global leaders and business executives are gathering in Glasgow for the COP26 Climate Summit. ORSTED, the renewables firm, is one of the firms among them. It set long-term net zero targets, which have been approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative. Now, ORSTED is aiming for the full decarbonization by 2040. Well, to get us started in Glasgow, I'm delighted to be joined by Mads Nipper, the Chief Executive Officer of ORSTED. Thank you so much, Mads.
Good morning.
I mean, a good conversation I'm expecting, first of all, on the energy crisis and renewables. So you speak to renewable chief executives and they say, well, this means that we need more renewables. And then you speak to governments or, maybe some climate deniers that say, well, actually, if we have the energy crisis, it's because we need the transition to be a lot longer. Where's the truth?
I obviously believe that the truth is we need to roll out renewables a lot faster. Because I think that what happens with the energy crisis is the root cause of that is the price of gas. And if we want to make ourselves less dependent on price swings and availability of gas and fossil fuels for that matter, we simply need to build more renewables faster, because that's the only way we can avoid that.
But, Mr. Nipper, what happens, for example, here in the UK, where they had wind turbines, but there was not enough wind? I mean, maybe this is the first time in 30 years that it's happened, but yet it's happened.
It has happened, but I still think that the main root cause of the energy crunch and the extreme prices we have seen are driven by availability of gas, because the gas storages across all of Europe, due to the cold winter and due to the sort of surging fossil fuel demand after COVID, regrettably. And that means that those prices have gone up extremely. And that is the root cause of this. And then, coincidentally, it was a low wind period, which of course is bad luck. But please don't blame it on lacking wind, because one, wind will come back. And two, if we have sufficient renewable sources, that will not reoccur.
We've done serious progress since 2015 and the Paris Agreement, but there was disappointment over the weekend at the G20 in Rome.
Yes.
What are you expecting from Glasgow?
I am still optimistic because I do think that, we are in a situation where the technology is there, the capital is even there, so it is a matter of it's a leadership challenge. Yeah. And I do believe that there will be stepped up national determined commitments. I simply cannot imagine that the world's leaders will fail to make those, because the costs of dealing with climate change in some years is obviously many, many times higher than preventing it. So it was not a good G20. Yeah. But fact is, I think that there will be some stepping up of commitments.
How difficult is it if China's not here? How difficult is it if Brazil is not here? And again, what are some of the conversations that you're having with governments about the pledges that they're making to you?
It is difficult, but I think the last thing we can do or allow ourselves is that if all of us, the rest of us, whether we're business leaders or state leaders, if we say, well, it really doesn't matter if Brazil and China are not here. Fact is, it matters, and China is the world's largest emitter, and their plan by net zero by 2060 is not good enough. And we cannot, as an international society, live with the fact that the emissions will top by 2030. But the rest of us have to show the good example and saying there is a different way, it's possible, and we can even increase our living standards at the same time.
But is a good example then having your net zero pledges being certified like you have?
Yes.
Is there a plea that you're telling the industry now that you can pledge, but actually if it's not the right numbers, then they mean nothing at all?
That's exactly right. I mean, we are many business leaders who sort of cry to governments and saying, please increase your NDCs. Now's the time, step up, and that is only credible if we take our own medicine, so to speak. If we say we make our own commitments and we make them based on a sort of on an objective and science-based framework, which is a science-based target initiative, which is really the best known way of doing it, because it says first you need to be able to measure, then you reduce, and only the small remainder you should offset. Because there are many people who say we will be net zero, yes, but it's offsetting. That's not good enough.
But I have many financiers saying, look, offsetting is needed for the transition. Do you think we should just scrap offsetting or just make it much more harder to make it count as doing good for the planet?
No, I think that ORSTED as an example, we have just gotten our 2040, so 10 years ahead of the net zero plan, 2040 net zero plan, including our scope 3, science-based approved as only one of 7 companies in the world. And that is because we have less than 10% emissions left by 2040 that we will offset. And I think that's a wonderful thing to do, saying there will be things that are incredibly difficult to reduce. So allowing some offset up to, for example, 10% is a good thing. Otherwise, it'll probably be impossible. But saying that you'll be net zero by having 50 or 70% offset, it simply doesn't stack up.
What were you most disappointed at G20? I mean, ORSTED is also fascinating because you did that transition, right, from oil and gas to renewables.
Yes.
Was it the methane, the fact that there wasn't this full pledge on methane, or was it coal that disappointed you most?
It was the general message that there was no real step up. And I think coal is such a major problem because the energy sector the production of and consumption of energy is 73% of the world's emissions. So the energy system transformation is so vital for us to succeed, and coal is the biggest problem. So we simply we needed not only do we need to stop burning coal, but we simply need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. We need to set, like the UK did recently, say, latest by that date, we will have a fully renewable power generation. And by the way, we will commit to increasing the world's power consumption from currently, I think it's around 20% electricity, to up to 70 to 80%. Otherwise, we won't succeed.
But do you think, and this is because the G20 failed to do it, is there a sense of urgency that means that COP26 will be able to do it, or is it something that we need to push back for 12 months?
I choose to be optimistic that we will be more tangible at COP26. But the fact is, I was disappointed after G20. Yeah. Is there still a fighting chance we can keep net zero alive here at COP26? Yes, there is. And we must all do what we can to advocate for that and also take our own commitments as company leaders. But I have to say I'm probably a tad less optimistic than I was on Friday.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us. Mads Nipper, there, the Chief Executive of ORSTED. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, Chief Executives throughout the day. We'll also keep an eye on climate. A new United Nations report outlines what countries need to do drastically to lower greenhouse gases. Well, Bloomberg's Jess Shankelman explains how we got here.
This is where global emissions are today. And this is where global emissions need to get to by 2050 to stop what scientists say will be catastrophic climate change. And this space here is what's called the emissions gap. Closing it might sound simple enough, but time is running out and the blame game is already well underway. The Paris Agreement is our best hope of stopping the planet from dangerous global warming. But it's just a first step. Nearly 200 nations pledged to limit temperatures from rising above 2 degrees Celsius, or if possible, 1.5 degrees. And those countries are going to be debating about who should do what for many years to come. Here's the problem. Each set their own plans and together aren't doing enough to cut greenhouse gases in time. Emissions fell dramatically in the pandemic, but carbon dioxide lingers in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, so a temporary drop won't make much difference to the overall trend. Scientists say the world needs to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Some nations, like Bhutan, have already met their goal decades early, but others are dragging their heels, particularly those whose economies rely on oil and gas, such as Russia and Saudi Arabia. Then there are the developing nations like Indonesia and Bangladesh, who say they can only consider tougher emissions targets if rich countries deliver on their promise to raise more money to help them. There is a lot of disagreement over who is to blame for all the emissions in the atmosphere and how some countries already got rich from polluting. China was responsible for just this portion of emissions in the past. But today, it's the world's largest polluter. So they agreed. Each country would come up with their own voluntary plan about what they thought they could realistically do. These plans are called nationally determined contributions. They aren't enforced, and there are no penalties for failing to meet them. Right now, countries have targets for 2030 and have agreed to meet every few years to make sure they are on track and raise their ambition. But as of now, emissions are still too high, and according to the United Nations, we're heading towards a 3-degree rise this century.
Our reporter Jess Schenkelman there explaining some of the background to this year's COP summit. Now let's get the latest news with Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Francine. Jess Staley is to step down as Barclays CEO with immediate effect after preliminary conclusions from a UK regulatory probe into his ties to the financier and sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Staley had previously said he volunteered to tell the Barclays board his version of how his 15-year professional relationship with Epstein evolved. Staley says he intends to contest the conclusions of the investigation by the Financial Conduct Authority. Boris Johnson has issued a rallying cry to world leaders at the start of the COP26 climate summit, urging countries to act immediately to avert a disaster. The UK Prime Minister is expected to tell the opening ceremony of the meeting that it's 1 minute to midnight and we need to act now. At the weekend's G20 meeting, countries agreed a climate deal that fell well short of what some nations were pushing for.
The countries most responsible for historic and present-day emissions are not yet doing their fair share of the work. If we are going to prevent COP26 from being a failure, then that must change. And I must be clear that if Glasgow fails, then the whole thing fails.
President Joe Biden is joining other world leaders at the UN COP summit without a signed and sealed budget agreement from Congress. The US leader has a handshake commitment from lawmakers to spend $555 billion fighting global warming, but the draft legislation still has to overcome votes in the House and Senate. The package includes extending incentives for the use of solar power and electric vehicles. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Tom.
Laura, thanks so much. Laura Wright in London. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more from Glasgow. It's the first working day here at COP26. We have world leaders arriving, I think, shortly. We'll also be hearing from a couple of heads of state. This is Bloomberg. Welcome to the Bloomberg COP26 Climate Special. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Glasgow. Now, leaders are starting to arrive at COP26. You can see Boris Johnson, the host, of course, with Italy of this Glasgow COP26, just greeting. I mean, I think he's on stage just a couple of meters away from where we are, greeting a lot of the heads of state that are arriving. Overall, it's 200 countries that will be represented, over 30,000 delegates. So the organization of this place is really quite incredible. It does last about 2 weeks. Now, what we heard over the weekend was the G20, and of course this meeting follows the G20 in Rome, where countries struck a climate deal that fell well short of what some nations were pushing for. It's now up to the negotiators at COP26 here in Glasgow to try to achieve a breakthrough this week. Now, for more, let's get to our climate reporter Akshat Rati. Akshat, I mean, first of all, the security zone. I mean, the security to get in here, it is literally like getting on a plane, and it feels like you're going to the terminal. You have COVID tests, and you have quite a lot of security to get through in general.
Yes, it does. And we're expecting the queues to be quite long because of that. But also, it's a rainbow of humanity. You know, 200 countries being represented. Almost all of them are sending delegates, and multiple of them, some of them are sending hundreds of delegates. So the cacophony of languages is wonderful.
Yeah, it is wonderful. So we're just hearing and seeing actually Boris Johnson greet a lot of the leaders as they come in. How much of a disappointment was the G20? I mean, they represent 80% of global emissions.
They do.
If they can't come up with something with teeth, what are the guys here going to do?
So the G20 is always about political consensus making, right? What is it that the largest emitters agree on? But at Glasgow, we're going to talk about the details, right? We're going to lay down the rules of how to cut emissions. We're going to talk about how to create a carbon market. So there's much more that will happen in Glasgow compared to what happened in the G20. The G20 did give a signal that they would like to reduce the use of coal by at least stopping international financing. That'll make some impact, but what we really need is for coal to be phased out domestically. Now, can we see any movement over here? we'll see.
So who are the leaders you're most excited to hear from?
So Joe Biden will be here, the U.S. president, and of course he's not been able to get a climate deal back home, a law that he was hoping to pass with trillions of dollars in spending. So what is he going to bring to the table? The U.S. talks a lot about being the leader on climate. What is that going to look like? I'm going to look out for Prime Minister Modi of India because we don't have yet a new statement from India, and we expect there to be some sort of news, hopefully something ambitious. I'm also very interested in the president of Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka is one of the developing countries that has its emissions still going up and doesn't have the financial heft of rich countries, and yet it wants to reach net zero by 2050, which I think is quite ambitious.
Okay, Akshat, thank you so much. I have many more questions of what we've achieved from 2015, so we'll get you back on for that. Our climate reporter there, Akshat Rati. Now, U.S. Special Envoy John Kerry has scolded other major emitters for not ratcheting up their pledges to cut emissions. Well, he spoke to Bloomberg ahead of COP26.
I think the business world is at large, for the most part, beginning to really sit down and grapple with the things that we have to do. So my hope is that some of the countries, there are 20 countries, Francine, that are the equivalent, that equal 80% of all the emissions. Those 20 countries, above all, have to step up. There are some countries in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, they barely produce very much emissions. They're not going to make the difference. Those 20 countries, most of which are in the G20, make a huge difference. And we have about 55% of GDP, global GDP, committed to keep the 1.5 degrees alive, but that leaves 45% still outside.
So, Secretary, do you see a high risk of failure at COP26?
No, I don't, because I believe that at COP26, most countries in the world are going to step up with major raising of ambition. And I think that the COP26 will achieve a significant increase of ambition at the beginning of the decade, which is the critical decade. We have to do more, and we'll have to do it faster. But I think that's going to be a marked jump up from where we were in the last few years post-Paris.
But, Secretary, even with every country's current efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they're still expected to increase 16% by 2030. So are we failing the next generation?
No, not yet. And that's why Glasgow is so important. We obviously have an obligation to get the job done. But some countries are, for various reasons, not yet decided to push the limit with respect to some of the reductions that we need to achieve. 55% of GDP, I mentioned, is committed to hold 1.5 degrees. That includes the United States, Canada, the Japan, the EU, and the UK. But there are other countries which emit very significant amounts that have not yet put themselves on that glide path to be able to achieve that. Our hope is that with Glasgow, there will be a recommitment to that effort. There's a fixed process in the Paris Agreement by which we will all meet in 2023 and take stock of exactly where we are. I think we can take stock right now sufficiently to be able to raise the ambition to do more. And that is still what we are trying to do as we head to Glasgow.
Well, that was U.S. Special Envoy for Climate John Kerry speaking to us ahead of COP26. Now, coming up, we look at how China, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, may actually influence the outcome of climate talks in Glasgow. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg.
China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060.
China is one of several Asian nations ramping up their climate pledges ahead of the pivotal COP26 summit. But details on how the world's top carbon emitter plans to reach those targets have been scarce.
The goals that President Xi has set out for China are encouraging, but we call for that same leadership on setting out how China will get there.
A concrete plan is crucial to the success of COP26, with China responsible for 27% of global emissions. But the first major energy crisis of the green transition era is already highlighting the difficult balance Beijing faces. Coal still accounts for more than 70% of China's electricity mix, with the recent shortage hitting everywhere from factory floors to homes. More than half of the nation's provinces are now facing their worst power supply disruptions in over a decade. Shortages could become the new normal if policymakers keep restraining electricity consumption to meet their 2060 zero emissions goal. Still, China is already the world's largest producer of wind and solar power and the biggest investor in renewables. A newly unveiled 400 gigawatt mega project that rivals Europe's entire installed renewable capacity is an example of Beijing's ambitions. China sees the green push as another opportunity to lead innovation, scale up new technologies, and improve its own national and energy security. But the challenge may be getting Beijing to put aside diplomatic differences to reach a real breakthrough. Delegates believe cooperation between the two superpowers, who together account for more than half of all emissions, is the only way to reach an historic deal akin to the Paris Accord. But they see tension between the two sides as the biggest obstacle in Glasgow, and expectations are low for what may be the most important round of climate talks ever.
Well, that's it for today's Bloomberg's COP26 climate special. Tomorrow, we hear from the chief executives of Unilever, Deutsche Bank UK, and Bank of America. This is Bloomberg.